Good morning and good evening, Yossi. What time is it in Israel right now?
It is 7 p.m.
Okay. Okay. Well, thanks for your flexibility. Sorry for the scheduling mix-up, but I'm glad that we get some time with you, and we'll be
Thank
sure to
you.
share this with the
Thank
congregation.
you for your flexibility. And it's great to be back with you, Dan.
It is. It is. We're going to miss you at the holidays, but our heart is very much with you, and you have been, and all of Israel has been on our mind. Maybe to start with, Yossi, it's been an incredible 72 hours in the midst of an incredible 340 plus days. Um, where where are things at, and how have things changed over the last 72 hours?
The main change is that the focus has shifted definitively from Gaza to the north, which is potentially good news for the hostages. Uh, what worries me, though, is that if we're in an all-out war with Hezbollah in the next week, which is more likely than not, the hostages could get sidelined again. And so I mean, I'm hearing different things. The government apparently finally has made a credible offer to Hamas to end the fighting, end the war in Gaza, safe passage for Yahya Sinwar out of Gaza in exchange for all the hostages. And that seems to me a tenable arrangement. The so the main change really is that the war has shifted to the northern front. But you know, the northern front has been active since October 8th. It's an illusion that this has been the Hamas-Israeli war. This is really the Iranian-Israeli war. And this is something that I've been trying to get across in the media interviews that I do and writing, is that there's a very profound disconnect in how Israelis see this war and most of the world sees it. The world sees this as Israel versus the Palestinians. And we see this as Israel versus Iran. And what really began on October 7th was the Iranian-Israeli war. And that war is now going to take its next inevitable turn. But this next phase of the war is going to be very difficult, very excruciating.
There's so much to unpack in just what you said. To just turn back to Gaza and the hostages for a moment. I mean, prior to the pagers and the walkie-talkies, of course, the North was very much on everybody's mind, but there was so much energy around the hostages after the murder of the six. A few weeks ago, the outpouring of grief from Israel was palpable all the way over here, and there seemed to be a real divide within Israel about the prioritization of bringing home the hostage. You spoke to this a little bit, or more than a little, and what that would mean for the government's social contract with the people versus the more hawkish, extreme right wing, that see military victory is the only way and continued military pressure. Can you speak to where things are at with the hostages and the Israeli psyche now?
Yeah, the difficulty here is that we have a prime minister who a majority of Israelis regard as thoroughly untrustworthy. And in polls taken in recent months, a majority of Israelis say that Netanyahu cares more about his own political interests than he does about the fate of the hostages. Now, for me, that's a given. Well, what that means is that for the first time in Israel's history, you have a total disconnect of trust between the citizens and the prime minister on the most basic issues of life and death. And the thought that we have a prime minister for whom the lives of Israelis is not the number one priority, that it doesn't keep him up awake at night, drives us mad. And that has practical consequences. My concern is that if, God forbid, the hostages die in captivity, many Israelis are going to blame this government. And that's going to create a rupture in the basic solidarity of this country. You know, the principle of Pidyon Shvuim, of redeeming the captives, it not only was a foundation for 2,000 years of Jewish life in exile, it really helped define us as a people. We knew that we would take care of each other no matter what. But that became the foundation of the ethos of the IDF. You never leave behind anyone on the battlefield. And Netanyahu has been trying to sell the public on the idea for the last few weeks that the most important goal of this war is holding on to the Philadelphia corridor, even if it means that the hostages are not prioritized. But a majority of Israelis didn't believe that. We didn't believe that the Philadelphia corridor was the existential threat that Netanyahu said it was. Because if it was, why didn't we take the Philadelphia corridor on October 8th? Why did we wait months before finally getting around to the corridor? And I'm talking about, of course, the border between Gaza and Egypt. So there's such a lack of faith, of goodwill in the relationship now between many of us and the government that I worry about Israelis just starting to opt out and say this isn't the same Israel anymore. And in Israel that I can't depend on my government to care about the lives of fellow Jews, that they'll prioritize their political needs before Jewish life. That's a kind of historic rupture. So, and you know, Dan, for the first months of the war, I actually agreed with the government that we need to prioritize victory over saving the hostages, because I felt that October 7th was such a seismic shift in Israel's strategic position in the Middle East that we needed to reclaim the credibility of our deterrence. But the more I listened to people, the more I realized that people are seeing this as a break in their relationship with the state. That in itself has strategic consequences. And so I felt that we need to prioritize the hostages. Certainly at this stage, after a year of fighting in Gaza, I don't know how much more we can achieve. And especially now that the front is shifting to the north, which is where it should be shifting to, I think we can afford to wind down the fighting in Gaza, make a deal on the hostages, and focus on what really is the more strategic threat, which is Hezbollah and Iran.
Thank you for that. That rupture in Israeli society, I mean, we're seeing some evidence of that here in Vancouver. We had a welcome session for new immigrants to Canada in the Jewish community over the weekend, and there were dozens of Israelis, many, if not most, who had been displaced from the north, who Canada has a special program. You can come in on you get a work permit and come in for 3 years, a similar program to what they've done for people coming in from Gaza as well and from other areas. We were overwhelmed by how many Israelis had decided that they were going to be here. Some of whom said we're going to go back when we can go back, but others who were noticeably relieved and were reevaluating where they wanted to raise their families.
And that has to do, in part, it's not only the danger, it's also the feeling that something basic has been broken, basic trust, the covenant between the state and the citizens. And so at the very least, we need to try to restore that basic trust by saving the hostages.
And you spoke the other day on the podcast with Danielle about your thoughts that the Mossad's operation, if we can call it that, they haven't claimed it yet, but had restored some
we can take a risk of
take the risk, and I guess to some degree, even with all of its severity, to take the win. And there was a sense that you shared, and I share with you, that this may have restored some confidence in the intelligence and the defense apparatus, a much needed boost to Israeli morale, that we're not constantly being caught in a reactive mode. You want to talk about that at all? And then there's, of course, the strategic aspect of whether this is going to change the playing field.
Look, I understand the concern that Danielle, for example, was raising in our podcast, that this attack on Hezbollah seems to be in a void. It doesn't have a strategic envelope. And I'm not sure I agree with that, but I think that that's an important critique, and we need to consider that. But I think that as you just noted, there are immediate benefits to such a stunning achievement. And I think at a certain point, a country, that's fighting an existential war, that's so demoralized, and going back again to the blow against our credibility, our deterrence. Something like this comes along. This is an historic moment. There's never been anything quite like this in anyone's war. And so you pocket a moment like this. And I just feel grateful that we still have it in us to surprise the enemy, that we're still capable of such ingenuity in defending ourselves. Now, in terms of the strategic consequences, obviously, this is our formal declaration of war. And in principle, I believe that we had to come to this moment sooner or later. First of all, we can't leave 70,000 Israelis from the north out of their homes. Not all of them will seek refuge in the work program in Canada. And we have a moral debt. And it's not only moral, it's also strategic. The thing about it's the same dynamic as with the hostages. There's a moral debt to the hostages, but saving them also has a strategic component. And in Israel, it's very hard to separate the moral from the strategic. So here too, we have a moral responsibility to reassure Israelis that we still have an army and a government that's capable of protecting us in our homes. And the fact that tens of thousands of Israelis have been refugees in their own country for the last year is unacceptable. And every day that goes by is another blow against the credibility of Zionism. And so we have to go to war with Hezbollah. I don't believe there's a negotiated settlement. Hezbollah is violating the terms of the 2006 ceasefire after the Second Lebanon War, when it was supposed to reposition behind the Litani River. I think it's about 20 kilometers from the Israeli border. And it's sitting instead literally on the border. And we have to push them back. And so my only concern is whether this government has the capability of uniting the country for this next far more difficult phase of the Iranian-Israeli war. And Netanyahu certainly is the last person that I would want to follow into battle. And so in principle, this government can't do it. In practice, this is the only government that we have. And when you have so many Israelis living in hotel rooms, whole families crammed into hotel rooms, families that are disintegrating. We have a hotel here in our neighborhood that's become a center for uprooted Israelis. And a friend of mine works as a social worker there. And I said, what's the atmosphere like? She says, families are just falling apart. And it's a 4-star hotel. It's the Dan Hotel in French Hill. And lovely hotel from the outside, and you go inside and it's a refugee center. And so we have to resolve this. And there's no way around confronting Hezbollah. And so, my understanding is, and I don't have any inside information, I read what you read, and that is that there was apparently concern in the Mossad that Hezbollah was catching on to the problematics of the beepers. And so the decision was made, just go ahead and do it. And if I were the prime minister and you were the head of the Mossad and you came to me and said, it's now or never, I think I would say now. Yeah. Just literally press the button.
Yeah. I mean, it was a remarkable achievement in that regard, in all of its brutality. And it's hard to get more targeted than the people that are carrying the pagers and the walkie-talkies are the operatives that you're targeting. Of course, there's people standing around them and children and all of those things. I guess the question is, militarily, can it be done? Does Israel have enough material, enough personnel, enough koyach to do this? We see Germany pulling back on its arms shipments, the UK. Surely they've expended a tremendous amount of material in Gaza. The IDF is not a huge force, and it's got to be exhausted in many ways. And one other thing I would just add is that if we look at and I'm not a military historian, but if we look at sort of the history of modern military conflicts, they tend not to end through military battle, but ultimately through some diplomatic solution. Is there the diplomatic Rahmanis in the international community to push Hezbollah back to restore to the 2006 peace treaty, and to do anything for Israel on Israel's behalf?
I don't see the international community being prepared to use its leverage against Iran, because it's not Lebanon. Lebanon has no control over Hezbollah, and Hezbollah is not an independent operator. Hezbollah takes its marching orders directly from Iran. Hezbollah's commanders are Iranian Revolutionary Guards. So Hezbollah, in effect, is the front line against Israel of Iran. And if you're going to push Hezbollah back, you need to severely pressure Iran. I don't see the international community doing that. I don't see anyone in the international community being prepared to do that. For that matter, I don't see anyone being prepared to stop Iran from crossing the nuclear threshold, let alone push pressure Iran to push Hezbollah back. So no, this is on us, as I'm afraid the nuclear issue is also going to be on us.
And does Israel have the capability to handle this?
I don't know, but at a certain point, I feel that question, as important as it is, becomes irrelevant. Because if this is an existential issue for us, then we have no choice. We have to try. Mm-hmm. And that goes for pushing Hezbollah back, and it also goes for stopping the Iranian nuclear program.
The frightening times, and
I'm afraid I don't have too much good news at the moment.
Well, things aren't so great on our side of the pond either. I mean, schools are back. University campuses are back to being, certainly inundated with anti-Israel protests and marches and kafiyah days and those kinds. And my son's at the University of Ottawa, and apparently September 11th was supposed to be kafiyah day at U Ottawa, but they realized that the optics of having kafiyah day on September 11th wasn't so good. So instead of canceling it, they just moved it to the next day. You've talked a bit about the experiences on campuses. You were touring on campuses earlier in the year. Any thoughts on that environment now, and any advice to parents that are listening to this as their kids either come home or reach out to them over the high holidays?
For the first time over this last year of traveling around campuses, and I've been doing this for years, probably 30 years, lecturing about Israel on campuses and Jewish communities. This was the first time that I felt that Israelis and North American Jews are sharing the same sense of vulnerability. Now, it plays out differently, obviously, in each community. But, in the past, when Israel went to war, when we were feeling vulnerable, diaspora Jews stood with us. But this is different. In the past, I knew that you had my back. Now the question that I hear from diaspora Jews is who has our back? And this is really, we've never been in this situation before, at least not in our lifetimes. So we're really looking at a situation where there's no map. And I find it very difficult for me as an Israeli to give advice to kids on campus. It's easy for me to say, be proud, stand up. And I hope that Jewish kids will do that. But what a situation where to stand up on a campus today and identify with Israel is the equivalent of when I was going to college, to stand up at a liberal university and say, I support apartheid South Africa, and to risk that kind of isolation. So any of our kids who actually do that in this atmosphere, who stand up and support Israel, I think these kids are extraordinary. And there are so many of them that I've met around Canada and the US that it's very humbling. So look, I think that the Jewish community is doing really what it should be doing. I think that it took a little time for the organized community to really catch on and to figure out how to start mobilizing. But I think that that's now happening. And certainly the spontaneous revolt of alumni donors has had a tremendous impact. And we've seen the resignation, essentially forced resignations, of half a dozen university presidents. There was just a resignation the other day of someone from the state university system in New York, a university president. So I think that on the official level, we're starting to see results, but this problem goes so much deeper than the official level. And it goes much deeper than kafia days and the tent camps. Those are all really worrying, and they are almost physical threats, sometimes actually physical threats to Jewish kids on campus. But what worries me much more about what's happening on campus is the impact of the anti-Zionist campaign on students generally, on students who are not necessarily politicized. There's a whole generation that's growing up now that hears the word Israel, and the first association is apartheid, genocide, even if you think it might not be true. Maybe they're wrong. But that's the instinctive association. That's a historic victory of the anti-Zionists. The other side of it, though, is that the anti-Zionists may have gone too far. And every time they burn an American flag at their demonstrations, do they burn Canadian flags?
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah.
I have to tell you that I see that and I say, guys, keep going.
Mm-hmm.
Keep going. You're my worst enemy and you're my greatest ally at the same time.
Right.
And they're their own worst enemies. And there's so much revulsion against them. And I think that the rise of the right in North America and in Europe, especially the rise of the far right. Look what happened in Holland, in Germany. Uh, I think it is in part a reaction to the mass demonstrations against Israel that are rightly seen by many people in the West as demonstrations against the West. So I guess that what I'm really trying to say is this thing is by no means played out.
It really is that big. It really does have this sense of what we had talked about sort of metaphorically for decades, a war of civilizations, a clash of civilizations that is playing out. And you're right, this is, one chess move in a series of many in a much larger scale. Feeds into so many of the, sort of the apocalyptic thinking on the right and the extremism on the left. And at the same time, it's happening in families' homes, right? It does have all these global implications, but there are those Jewish kids that are proudly standing up and putting the mezuzah on their door and wearing their Mogen David or whatever it is. And then there are those other Jewish kids that are in an expression of what they think is what they learned at Temple Sholom or at their Jewish summer camp, standing on the other side, saying, "You taught us." Love the neighbor as yourself. You taught us, if I'm only for myself, what am I? What do we say to those kids? Is there still a place? You talked about this, so I'm feeding you something that you talked about over the summer, and it's working in my sermon too. So, is there a place in the tent for them?
Well, I think that we need to have two responses to these kids, to our kids. They're communally our kids. The first is not to push them away. And the second is to rebuke them. And certainly not to indulge them and say, we really respect, the Tim Waltz line. Yes, what you're expressing this tremendous concern for social justice. Well, no, you're not. No, you're not, actually. Because if all you learned from the Jewish community was the second part of Hillel's statement, then the first part is at least as important. The first part is the foundation of life. If I'm not for myself, who will be? Because if I don't exist, I won't be able to exist for others. And if you couldn't learn that, love your neighbor, your friend as yourself, begins with loving yourself. You can't love your neighbor as yourself if you don't love yourself. And so I think there's place here for the Jewish community to ask itself some hard questions. How did we produce growing numbers of young Jews who only heard the message of social justice for others and not for ourselves, who apparently don't have the most basic instincts of Jewish protection? One of the things that stuns me is that for Jewish anti-Zionists, the takeaway of October 7th is that the problem is we have too much power. Now, October 7th was a little pre-enactment of what would happen to the 7 million Jews of Israel if the Israeli army disappeared. Because for one day, the army was completely ineffectual. That's your takeaway of the collapse of Israeli power on October 7th? That we need more of that? That's what you want as a permanent condition? So I'm completely perplexed, stunned, at a loss for words on what to say to these kids. But Dan, that's your job. You have to help us figure it out.
Well, I mean, and that's the sermon I've been trying to write for the last number of weeks. So, and I've been drawing on your words a lot for that. But I think the other job that we go ahead. Sorry, yes. That's it.
Yeah, I was on a podcast a few months ago with with Rabbi Ingber from
Yeah,
Roma,
David. Yeah, yeah.
and he said that after October 7th, he began his sermon with 3 words: "I love Israel." Full stop. No buts, no what about that. I love Israel, unequivocally.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe that diaspora Jews should criticize Israel when we deserve it. As you know, I appealed to diaspora Jews last year to get actively involved in the movement to stop the judicial coup in this country. And so I actively affirm not just the right, but the responsibility that diaspora Jews have to be full citizens of the Jewish people and get involved with Israeli issues in a deep way, to be my partner in angst.
Mm-hmm.
My only criticism of the way that the criticism often comes from the Jewish left is that when they'll say, I love Israel, but it's not I love Israel, but it's
Mm-hmm.
I love Israel and
Mm-hmm.
I love Israel, and here are the issues that we need to work on together. So, and if we're going to be really honest about it, we need to hear more of that I love Israel before the criticism comes.
Mm-hmm.
And so that for me is the foundation of any relationship. If the love isn't there, if it's all based on criticism.
Yeah. So we only have a little bit of time left, but I want to try to see if we can cover 2 more topics. We talked about the left, the extreme left here. There isn't really a left in Israel, but there is certainly a right, and you talked about an extreme right. We've talked about that, the influence that they have had over Netanyahu and policy and the government and this war. As we see the rise of the right throughout the West, it seems like even with all the protests in the streets in Israel, even with all the calls of the hundreds of thousands that are coming out, for the hostages, that the right still has quite a foothold in Israeli politics.
Tremendous. Look, the Jewish people is facing 2 almost existential threats internally. One is in the diaspora, specifically North America, and especially the United States, and the other is in Israel. The threat that you're facing, but again, I think it's really still more American Jewry than true for Canadian Jewry, is growing anti-Zionism. And what we're facing in Israel is growing anti-democracy.
Mm.
And when you think of the 2 flags on the bima of most North American synagogues, there's the Canadian or the American flag representing democratic values, and there's the Israeli flag representing Jewish commitment. And the entwinement of those 2 flags, metaphorically, is really the foundation of the diaspora-Israel relationship. And that's how we built the state of Israel, through a shared commitment to Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. If growing numbers of Jews in North America are going to begin questioning the legitimacy of a Jewish state, and growing numbers of Israelis are turning against democracy, we are tearing apart the foundation of our relationship. There'll be nothing left to talk about if Israelis turn against democracy and American Jews turn against Zionism. It's the end. It's the end of the relationship. And so for me, this really is an existential issue, the need to push back against these 2 growing forces on either side of the ocean. and each of which is undermining our community in different ways. Now, of course, in objective terms, the Israeli right is a much greater threat because the damage that it can do to Israel, the tangible damage, is far greater than the damage that anti-Zionist Jews could do. But in terms of an ideological assault on the Jewish future, in terms of tearing apart the foundation of the post-Holocaust Jewish success story, it's these two forces that worry me the most.
They worry me too, very much. And then in the larger context of all of the other conflicts and divisions and ruptures that are taking place
Yes.
in that region and around the world, and the US election, and Canada's got its own electoral issues. I don't know if it's just because I'm older now and paying more attention, and every generation goes through this in their 50s and 60s and 70s, that they worry about the future, but it sure does feel like any other time, no other time in my lifetime. And I grew up Reagan and the Cold War and the nuclear winter and all of that.
Well, look, every generation of Jews does go through that angst, but some generations have more reason.
Right. Lucky us. So with all of that, Yossi, and as we come into Rosh Hashanah in the last few minutes of our conversation, what gives you hope? Or is there any?
Yeah, of course. There's no. What gives me hope is what happened in Israel on October 8th. That we instantly pivoted from the lowest point in Israeli history in terms of our cohesiveness. We were never more divided than in the year leading up to October 7th. And then literally in one day, we became a united people again. Now, inevitably, that's been fraying in the last months. You can't maintain that level of hyper unity when there are so many issues that are still tearing us apart. But we have that model. We have that reminder that we haven't forgotten the instincts of peoplehood. And so October 8th gives me tremendous hope. And it gives me hope that when, God willing, this war is over, and it's the morning after, and we have to start facing each other in Israel and asking the hard question, do we still have anything in common with each other? Do we still trust each other to build a shared society? That we are going to have the experience of October 8th to draw on. And that gives me hope, gives me a lot of hope.
It gives me hope too, and I thank you for reminding me of that, because I was there in December and then in April, and to see Israeli civil society rally as they did, and and there's certainly a question of how sustainable that is, and that's what governments are for. It's not for volunteers to give up their jobs to to provide all the resources that they did to people that are displaced and to the military and all of those things. But it is remarkable, and the leaders that have come out of that movement and came out of the democracy movement before that, and hoping that there is a path for them to step in as a new generation of leaders for Israel, gives me hope also. And I'll just share one other thing, which is that here in our Canadian Jewish community, while there is some division about what's the best path forward, and certainly we have members of our community on the extreme elements, the center has never been more broad. The center of our community, and here I don't mean the physical buildings, but the people in it, that tent has expanded and it is filled up. We've brought in Israelis into congregations, into Jewish organizational life that were never present before. We've brought people out of working in the private sector that have wanted to come and work in Jewish institutions, whether it's our schools or organizations. Many for all the reasons that we hate for that to be the reason that they left, because they didn't feel safe or comfortable in their non-Jewish environment. But it has really been in many ways an infusion of Ahavat Yisrael, of love for Israel, and also just a love for Jewish people and Jewish community. and an acknowledgement of its necessity and its centrality that has been inspiring.
Fantastic. And I felt it too in my travels around North America. And look, there's no question we're going to lose people. Jewish anti-Zionist groups are going to grow. But as you put it, the center is growing faster. And the center will hold. I really believe that. And that's what's going to pull us through.
As my mother would say, from your mouth to God's ears. Yossi, we're going to miss you in shul this year. I know you'll be in shul where you are. And to you and Sarah and your whole family, a Shana Tova Mituka. And
family as well. And to all of you, I look very much forward to seeing you all again in Vancouver soon. Shana Tova.
Shana Tova. Thank you, Yossi. Thank you.